The sirens in Ouagadougou cut through the night air like a warning no one wanted to hear. In a quiet neighborhood, a grandmother clutched her grandson close, whispering a prayer under her breath. She wondered what the morning would bring. Would the bread at the market double in price, or would there finally be relief from the crushing weight of dependence? At the very same moment across town, President Ibrahim Traoré was preparing to announce something that would shake the foundations of global finance: the birth of a new African currency, Afro money, backed by Africa's own gold, cobalt, and oil. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not just about money. It was about dignity, survival, and the hope of handing their children a future no longer dictated by foreign powers. For decades, nations across Africa carried the burden of colonial-era currencies like the CFA franc, tightly controlled by France. Decisions about printing money, setting reserves, or protecting economies during crises were made far away in European capitals. Families like that grandmother's had lived with the consequences: unstable markets, rising food prices, and no real control over their future. Now Traoré was daring to cut that chain, to put the fate of Burkina Faso back into African hands. But such a bold step comes with risk. The history of Africa is filled with leaders who tried to defy the international order: Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi, only to meet violent ends. Could this new experiment succeed where others failed? Or would Burkina Faso pay a heavy price for trying to claim its independence in such a public, irreversible way? Before we go further, pause for a moment and ask yourself, if your own country's currency were printed under the approval of another nation, would you feel free? That question is at the heart of this story, and it is one that will determine not only the fate of Burkina Faso, but possibly the entire African continent. Ibrahim Traoré has set the stage. The world is watching. And the question that echoes tonight is simple yet terrifying. Has he just saved his people, or placed them in greater danger than ever before? The day Afro money was announced, the streets of Ouagadougou were electric. People lined up outside banks, markets buzzed with rumors, and radio stations played patriotic songs as if the nation had just won its independence again. But this was not simply a symbolic gesture. For the first time in modern African history, a government declared that its currency would no longer bow to foreign control. Afro money was not printed on empty promises. It was backed by hard resources: Burkina Faso's gold, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, oil from Nigeria, and uranium from Niger. These were not just commodities, but the very elements that the modern world cannot live without. Smartphones, electric cars, power plants all rely on them. Traoré's decision was more than bold. It was strategic. He chose resources that would make Afro money nearly impossible to ignore. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you have to look back. In the mid-20th century, when African nations declared independence, many believed freedom had been achieved. Flags changed, anthems were written, and leaders made speeches. Yet beneath the surface, one invisible chain remained intact: the chain of monetary control. The CFA franc, introduced by France, forced 14 African nations to keep much of their reserves in French banks, often interest-free. These nations could not print money without Paris's approval. They could not shield themselves when inflation struck or when markets collapsed. On paper, they were free. In reality, their economic lifeline was still controlled from abroad. This is the chain Traoré sought to break. For people like Musa, a farmer outside Bobo Dioulasso, the old system was more than theory. He had watched the price of fertilizer skyrocket because Burkina Faso had to import with currencies pegged to the euro. When inflation in Europe rose, his family paid the price in Africa. "I don't understand politics," he told a local journalist, "but I know this. Every year, I harvest less because I can afford less." For Musa, Afro money wasn't just a policy, it was survival. History shows how high the stakes are. In the 1960s, Congo's first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, tried to take control of his country's mineral wealth. Within months, he was overthrown and assassinated with foreign complicity. In the 1980s, Burkina Faso's own Thomas Sankara launched reforms to free the nation from debt dependency. He was killed in a coup widely believed to have had external backing. And in 2011, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African dinar to rival Western currencies. He was removed through NATO intervention. Each of these men challenged the financial order. Each paid with his life. That is the history standing behind Traoré's gamble. Yet this time, the ground feels different. France is losing its grip in West Africa. Military-led governments in Mali, Niger, and Guinea have aligned themselves with Burkina Faso in rejecting old alliances. The economic community of West African states, once dominated by French influence, is splintering. For the first time in decades, an opening has appeared and Traoré seized it. Still, questions remain. Afro money's infrastructure relies not just on printing notes, but on a blockchain core spread across African nations, designed to prevent sabotage. It is meant to withstand cyber attacks, sanctions, and even currency manipulation. But how will the people trust a system so new, especially after decades of disappointment? And how will foreign powers react when their economic dominance is directly challenged? At the launch ceremony, Traoré spoke with calm conviction. Our unity must be unity of purpose. Without control of our money, independence is an illusion. His words were met with cheers. Yet even as the crowd celebrated, diplomats in Paris, Washington, and Brussels were already calculating their response. For families like Musa's, Afro money promises relief, but history warns of consequences. Every time Africa tried to break free, the backlash was swift and brutal. As night fell over Burkina Faso, one truth hung heavy in the air. A new chapter had begun, but no one knew how long it would last. Afro money was more than currency. It was defiance stamped in ink and metal. But defiance comes at a price. The only question is, how much will Burkina Faso have to pay? The climax came not in quiet speeches or closed-door meetings, but in the open streets of Ouagadougou. Within hours of the announcement, crowds poured into Independence Square waving flags, chanting songs of liberation, and holding up freshly printed Afro money notes as if they were medals of honor. For many, this was the first time they had touched a currency that felt truly theirs. The faces on the bills, Sankara, Lumumba, Mandela, and Singa, were not distant symbols but reminders of a struggle that ran through their own families. Young people painted their portraits on walls while vendors proudly displayed the notes beside their goods. This is not just money, a young shopkeeper told a journalist. This is a weapon, and finally, it is ours. At the same time, the international press erupted. French outlets warned of dangerous destabilization in West Africa. Analysts in London and Washington debated whether Traoré had just taken his nation down a reckless path or lit a spark that could spread across the continent. On African social media, hashtags like AfroMoney and True Independence trended for days, fueled by youth movements eager for change. For many across the continent, it felt as though Burkina Faso had spoken for them all. Inside government halls, the reactions were mixed. In Mali and Niger, leaders applauded Traoré, calling it the first step toward an economic bloc free of French dominance. But in other capitals, officials aligned with the old system grew nervous. Some worried about sanctions, others feared political retaliation. We've seen this movie before. An anonymous West African diplomat confessed. We know how it ends. For leaders who try to defy the global order. Back in Ouagadougou, the atmosphere grew more tense as rumors swirled of possible retaliation. Families whispered about cyber attacks that could shut down banks or foreign powers working to isolate the country's trade. Yet amid the anxiety, pride was unmistakable. Thousands gathered for a rally outside the presidential palace, where Traoré appeared on the balcony and raised a single Afro money note high above his head. The roar that followed was deafening. It was a moment etched into memory, a declaration not just of independence, but of defiance. For elders in the crowd, the memory of past betrayals resurfaced. One retired soldier spoke of 1987, the year Thomas Sankara was assassinated after trying to free Burkina Faso from debt. His voice cracked as he looked at the new bills. They killed Sankara for less than this. If they come for Traoré, it will not be so easy. His words reflected a wider truth. Joy was heavy with fear. The people celebrated loudly, but in their hearts they braced for the storm. Meanwhile, foreign capitals moved quickly. Reports emerged that Western financial institutions were preparing to downgrade Burkina Faso's credit rating. Private banks began quietly warning investors to avoid exposure in the region. These were not tanks or soldiers, but financial weapons, tools that had broken nations before. And yet, for every warning of collapse, another voice in Africa shouted back in support. Afro money was already igniting debates in Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa. Could they join? Would they follow? The spark was spreading. The visual power of Afro money also fueled the climax. Images of Sankara staring defiantly from a bill circulated across African news outlets, paired with stories of how he fought against Western debt. Children saw Mandela not as the smiling elder of textbooks, but the young underground fighter. This was more than currency. It was education, rebellion, and memory stitched into every note and coin. For many Africans, it felt like history had finally been rewritten in their favor. As the celebration stretched into the night, the tension thickened. Families went home proud but cautious, locking their doors a little tighter, praying that the next morning would not bring sudden shortages, sanctions, or violence. Traoré had lit a fire, but fires attract wind and enemies. Standing on that balcony, holding the new note aloft, he looked unshaken. But the question echoed across the continent: how long can Burkina Faso withstand the storm that is surely coming? This was the moment of triumph, but also the moment of greatest danger. The world was no longer watching from a distance. It was preparing to act. The only question now is chilling. Will Africa's dream of financial freedom survive its first night? Or will it be crushed before it has the chance to take root? In the days following the launch of Afro money, daily life in Burkina Faso began to shift in subtle but powerful ways. At the central market in Ouagadougou, merchants proudly displayed price tags in the new currency. For the first time, buyers and sellers felt they were trading in something that belonged to them, not dictated by Paris. Yet alongside this pride, uncertainty lingered. Food prices edged upward as traders adjusted to the new system, and whispers spread of potential shortages if international suppliers refused to cooperate. Mothers buying rice and flour worried about how long their savings would last. For families already struggling, the excitement of Afro money carried the heavy shadow of risk. The political consequences were equally profound. Ibrahim Traoré's bold move elevated him overnight into a symbol of resistance across the continent, but it also painted a target on his back. Inside Burkina Faso, members of the political elite who had long benefited from deals with Western institutions grew restless. Some began quietly meeting behind closed doors, fearful that their wealth and influence would erode under this new system. Analysts warned that internal betrayal could be as dangerous as any external attack. History in the Sahel has shown again and again that revolutions are often undone not by foreign armies, but by insiders seeking to protect their own interests. Ordinary people felt the pressure as well. In the rural north, where militant groups already threatened security, villagers wondered whether new economic instability would worsen violence. A school teacher named Adama explained it simply: if food becomes harder to buy, young men without jobs will be recruited by the extremists. We want this new currency to succeed, but we cannot survive if it brings more chaos. His words captured the fragile balance between hope and fear that defined the national mood. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, Afro money began to stir debates. In Mali and Niger, leaders embraced the idea, signaling that their nations might join in the experiment. But in other countries, especially those still tied closely to France, politicians warned of disaster. This will bring sanctions and isolation, one West African finance minister said, and the people will be the ones to suffer. Such warnings carried weight, especially among older Africans who had lived through decades of economic crises. They understood that pride alone could not shield families from hunger. Still, the symbolic victory was undeniable. For the first time in generations, ordinary Africans could hold a note that celebrated their own heroes instead of foreign monuments. School children passed bills around in classrooms, pointing to the faces of Sankara and Mandela, asking teachers to tell their stories. The new currency had already begun to change how people thought about their history and their future. It was not just economics, it was identity. But challenges multiplied. Reports surfaced of banking networks experiencing cyber attacks, likely attempts to undermine confidence in Afro money. Social media campaigns spread rumors that the new bills would be worthless within weeks. Traders feared being cut off from global markets. Every day, Traoré's administration fought to maintain stability, not just through speeches, but by rushing shipments of rice and fuel into markets to reassure the people. The battle was not only financial, it was psychological. If citizens lost faith, the project would collapse before it had a chance to mature. Despite the struggles, many clung to hope. At Sunday church services across Ouagadougou, pastors reminded congregations that no true freedom comes without sacrifice. The Israelites wandered the desert before reaching the promised land, one preacher declared, holding up a note of Afro money. Burkina Faso may wander, but God does not abandon those who fight for justice. The congregation responded with a thunderous Amen. Faith became another pillar, holding up the fragile new order. Politically, the government tightened security around Traoré. Assassination attempts against African leaders who defied foreign control were not history. They were precedent. Extra guards patrolled the presidential compound, and intelligence reports warned of possible plots. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if the entire country was waiting for the first blow to fall. In hushed tones, people asked each other, Would Traoré end up like Sankara, or could he break the cycle? As Burkina Faso took its first steps into this uncertain new era, one truth was clear. Afro money had transformed the nation's identity overnight, but it had also placed a bullseye on its back. The joy of independence carried the weight of looming retaliation. For the people, the question was no longer whether they wanted freedom, it was whether they could endure the cost. And as tensions mounted, another question emerged from across the Atlantic. How would the United States respond? The launch of Afro money did not go unnoticed in Washington. Within hours, analysts at the State Department and the Pentagon were poring over reports, weighing the potential impact on U.S. interests in the Sahel. Officially, American spokesmen issued cautious statements, emphasizing stability and warning against rash economic experiments. Behind closed doors, however, the tone was far more urgent. The Sahel is already one of the most fragile regions in the world, plagued by insurgencies, terrorism, and humanitarian crises. For U.S. policymakers, the rise of a new currency, especially one designed to break free from Western financial systems, raised troubling questions. Could Afro money weaken the influence of the dollar? Would it pull countries like Mali, Niger, and Guinea further from U.S. partnerships and closer to rival powers such as Russia or China? France's reaction was swift and alarmed. French officials called Afro money a direct assault on decades of carefully maintained influence in West Africa. The European Union quietly debated sanctions but hesitated, aware that pushing too hard might drive African nations into the arms of other global players. Meanwhile, Russia and China expressed interest in supporting the project, seeing an opportunity to expand their foothold in Africa by bypassing Western-controlled systems like SWIFT. The geopolitical chessboard was shifting rapidly. For the United States, the stakes were clear. If Afro money gained traction, the balance of power in Africa could tilt away from traditional Western partners. American companies operating in mining and energy feared being forced to trade in the new currency, cutting into profits and complicating contracts. Even more concerning was the security dimension. Washington has long argued that economic stability is critical for counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel. If sanctions or financial disruptions fueled unrest, extremist groups could exploit the chaos. Some U.S. lawmakers began asking whether supporting Traoré quietly might be better than opposing him, if only to prevent greater instability. Yet the question remained, could America trust a young leader who had already aligned himself with anti-Western rhetoric? For older Americans watching this unfold, the echoes of the Cold War were unmistakable. Once again, a struggle for influence in Africa was underway, this time fought not with tanks or missiles, but with currency. The uncertainty hung heavy in Washington. And as one official admitted off the record, if this succeeds, we're looking at a new era. If it fails, the fallout could be even worse. Cliffhanger, the world now asks, could Afro money be the first spark in a much larger crisis? As the dust settled after the launch of Afro money, one reality became impossible to ignore. The battle for Africa's future would no longer be fought only on borders and battlefields. It would be fought in the wallets of everyday citizens. Burkina Faso had drawn a line that the world could not overlook. But history offers sobering lessons. Every attempt at financial independence in Africa has been met with fierce resistance. Already, intelligence sources whispered about cyber attacks, market manipulation, and disinformation campaigns designed to break confidence in Afro money before it could spread. If those tactics fail, more direct measures, political isolation, covert destabilization, or worse, remain on the table. The warning is clear. This currency may be Africa's greatest hope, but it could also trigger its greatest trial. For the people of Burkina Faso, life continues with uncertainty. Mothers in the market still count every coin, farmers still wait for fair prices for their crops, and children still dream of a future free from poverty. Afro money carries their hopes, but also their fears. If this project collapses under outside pressure, it is not just an idea that dies. It is the trust of millions of families who believe that change was possible. And once trust is broken, rebuilding it is far harder than printing new notes. Looking ahead, analysts debate scenarios. If the African Union rallies around Traoré within the next 3 months, building military and economic alliances, Afro money could become the foundation of a new continental market. But if Burkina Faso is left alone, history suggests the outcome could be tragic. A nation isolated, sanctions imposed, and a young leader forced into the same fate as Sankara, Lumumba, or Gaddafi. These are not distant fears. They are lessons carved into Africa's memory. The question is whether this time will be different. So we end with the question that lingers in the heart of every Burkinabe. Is Ibrahim Traoré the hope Africa has waited for, or a spark that could set the continent ablaze? For Americans watching, the story is more than distant news. It is a reminder that freedom, security, and justice are fragile, and that the fate of a small nation can ripple across the world. If this story has touched you, pause and reflect. What does freedom mean if your family's livelihood depends on the decisions of strangers in faraway capitals? If you believe in justice, in dignity, and in the rise of a stronger Africa, let your heart carry this message forward. May God bless Burkina Faso, may He bless Africa, and may He remind us all that the fight for justice never ends.